we take away that supplemental source of the hormone, what happens is that all of a sudden we're left in this state where our body is a little bit confused and just goes, oh, now you want me?
Welcome to the Healthy Skin Show with Jennifer Fugo, where we're flipping everything you've been told about your chronic skin issues upside down and connecting you with alternative solutions your dermatologist never told you about.
Welcome back to episode number 130 of the Healthy Skin Show. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about this interesting connection between the hormone known as cortisol and your skin. And this is important, especially if you are using topical steroid creams. Now, I'm not even talking about a long-term everyday use of topical steroid creams, but there is an interesting connection between the two that you do need to be made aware of. My guest today, Brie Wieselman, has been on the show before, so she's coming back. Actually, one of her episodes on adult acne is one of the most downloaded podcasts of all time on the show. So it's really great to have her come back and talk about this. Before we dive into that conversation, I wanted to answer a listener's question.
Hi, Jennifer. This is Angela. I have periofacial dermatitis. My dermatologist prescribed me an ointment, Tacrolimus, but it only made it worse. I go back to him in about a week, and I do not want to use steroids, nor do I want to take antibiotics. Do you have any other suggestion? I'd really appreciate your help, and I love your show. Thank you.
Angela, thank you so much for submitting this question. And I understand your concern. The product Tacrolimus is actually an immunosuppressant drug, believe it or not. It is used in certain dermatitis issues, from my understanding. But again, I'm not a dermatologist. And so that may be why your dermatologist gave that particular medication to you. I totally understand your discomfort in having to go the medication route. But here's the thing. There are options on the more quote unquote natural side of things that you can try. So I'm going to list them out here. And I'm also going to direct you to episode number 54 of the Healthy Skin Show, where Dr. Sarah Villafranco actually spoke about her personal experience with perioral dermatitis and how she has seen other people make significant improvements. That said, and this is really important to manage your expectations, in speaking to other individuals like Rachel Pontillo, who's one of the estheticians and experts that I utilize here at the Healthy Skin Show, that perioral dermatitis is one of the most notoriously difficult skin issues to treat. It's not like eczema. It does not respond well, first of all, to oils. So oils applied to the face can actually make things worse, and certain types of cleansers can also exacerbate things. Now, that's why with Dr. Sarah Villafranco, she has a skincare company called Osmia Organics, and they make this black clay bar that some people who have perioral dermatitis find to be very helpful. And in fact, I don't have perioral dermatitis, but I have a skin condition that is somewhat similar, and even I found improvements in using that black clay bar on my face. It sort of freaked me out to use a soap bar, to be honest with you, on my face, but it actually made a huge improvement. So I would suggest giving that a shot. The next thing is that some people have issues with the fluoride that's in their water. And that means not just the water that you're washing your face with, but also the water that you are drinking. And you can look at your local water report to find out if there's fluoride added to your water. And then you would need to find a filter if there is fluoride in order to remove it to see if that helps. Dr. Sarah Villafranco also mentioned about removing all products that contained SLS, which stands for sodium lauryl sulfate. It's worthwhile, for the sake of this conversation, and to make sure that this is fair and balanced. And actually, I feel like you do need to know this. The natural approach may help you get results, but it might not. And you have to know that going into this, that you may be backed into a corner where your only option after trying all the natural things is to go the antibiotic route. I have worked with several clients who have had perioral dermatitis. We've seen varying levels of improvement in using all of the natural tools within our disposal, looking at their gut microbiome, addressing issues within that microbiome, looking at their nutrient levels, detoxification factors, etc. And even through all of that, most of the time, they ultimately end up on the antibiotics because the antibiotics end up, for whatever reason, being more effective and finally getting them that clear skin. Now, one could argue that maybe all the other work that we did set them up for success. I don't really know. But the truth of the matter is, while many of us have been almost poisoned against certain conventional modalities like antibiotics, we think that they're the worst thing in the world. There is a time and a place for them. And if you're smart about how you use the antibiotics, using them as sparingly as possible and making sure to supplement with probiotics during that course of antibiotics and for a significant period afterwards, to make sure to rebalance and rebuild that microbiome, you're in a much better position than someone who just takes the antibiotics and thinks that they're done with things and doesn't worry about any other facets of their health. Ultimately, you have to make the decision of what's right for you. But what I would encourage you to do is to have an open discussion with your doctor about your concerns. If you want to give some of these natural suggestions that I suggested a try, do that. But you're going to have to give your skin probably about a month to a month and a half to see if these natural options even really help. There is nothing fast that you can do. So if you're looking for some really fast solution here, unfortunately, if you go the natural route, that just doesn't exist. You have to give your skin time and then have that discussion again about the potential conventional options if you find that you've exhausted the natural options. And if you've got a question, just like Angela submitted hers, you can head on over to healthyskinshow.com. Scroll down a tad, you'll see a blue or teal microphone there. You can leave us a message so that your question can be featured on an upcoming episode of the Healthy Skin Show. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's conversation with my guest, Brie Wieselman, on the connection between your skin and cortisol.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And I have to tell you, I've got a recurring guest who is on the Healthy Skin Show 2 times last year. She's one of the top downloaded podcast episodes and experts. So I invited her back for you guys. Her name's Brie Wieselman. So maybe you remember her. We talked about PCOS and diet changes for PCOS and acne last year. We're going to talk about something a little different this year. But for those of you who don't know her, Brie is a digestive health and hormone balance specialist working with women around the world in her online practice. Besides women's health, Brie specializes in helping people with digestive problems such as IBS, parasitic infections, candida overgrowth, and SIBO to rebuild a bulletproof microbiome. Using her programs that integrate functional medicine and Chinese medicine approaches, she has worked with hundreds of clients living anywhere from Dubai and New Zealand to California, empowering them with a personalized roadmap for understanding and transforming their health. Brie, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to be talking about some hormone things that people don't necessarily relate to skin problems. So I would love to start off with cortisol because most people only think of it as a stress hormone, but they may not fully know how it could impact their skin. So could you start off by sharing with everyone what exactly is cortisol and where does it come from?
So cortisol gets such a bad rap because it gets nicknamed the stress hormone, but it's really our stress response hormone. It's our body's response and priming to optimize you to respond to what it perceives as stress. So I guess that's the first point, is that stress is perceived in the brain, and it can be mental, physical, emotional stress or inflammatory stress. And so the brain perceives that this is going on, and then it sends signals. It sends these hormones, releasing hormones like corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, we'll say. And then that prompts cortisol release, as well as some other hormones like adrenaline. Mainly, this is released by the adrenal glands. But what's interesting is that recently we found out that the skin is actually an extra adrenal site for the synthesis of these hormones. So
really?
Not only does it respond to the hormones, but actually like the CRH I just mentioned, cortisol itself, another adrenal hormone called ACTH, and melatonin, which is also kind of part of the regulation of our HPA axis or adrenal system. Those are all produced in the skin. And so, I mean, it's crazy because, we've known that the skin is this endocrine organ as well. Like it has multiple categories it falls into. But, that was something that was new to me when I happened upon it, a year or two ago. Like, wow, it's not just the adrenals.
Wow. And that's really neat because a lot of times we think of, I don't know, you're right. There's a lot of negative things that go around when we talk about cortisol and your adrenals, and everybody thinks they have adrenal fatigue. And we just only think about it in terms of energy. But when it comes to the skin, boy, stress certainly impacts your skin for sure. And,
oh my gosh, yeah.
So is there any tie between that and cortisol, since obviously that's a hormone that happens in response to stress? Like, is there a relationship there between the stressors that we experience and then the hormone that's released impacting the skin?
Absolutely. So basically the tie-in here is modulation of inflammation, or in this case, inflammaging also. We'll get to that in a minute. But so in skin, we know that multiple inflammatory conditions are either triggered or aggravated by stress, and, psoriasis, eczema, or atopic dermatitis, that same category, acne of various kinds, contact dermatitis, alopecia, and then just like itching or hives. Those can all be either caused or worsened by stress and primarily elevated cortisol. So the tie-in there is inflammation. And what's really interesting is that cortisol's effect on skin and its relationship to inflammation can be positive or negative. And it has okay, so here's where it gets a little bit complicated, but we're going to break it down real simple.
Perfect.
Like the nitty gritty. So it has to do with short-term stress or long-term stress, or short-term or long-term exposure to cortisol and the stress hormones. So in order to start to wrap our heads around this, we just need to look at the effect of long-term prednisone or topical steroid creams on the skin to see evidence that long-term exposure to cortisol, which is essentially the same thing, just endogenously produced, made inside our own bodies, to see evidence that that's not beneficial for the skin. Long-term glucocorticoid use as therapy for treating inflammatory diseases of the skin, we know that it causes the skin to atrophy. So you get, the epidermis gets thinner, and there's other hallmarks of skin aging like poor wound repair and less collagen and, more wrinkles and things like that. So basically what happens is that the effect of the cortisol and cortisol releasing hormones in different types of skin cells is really diverse and cell specific. So in some cells, it inhibits cell proliferation. In others, it can act like a growth factor. And then, for example, in mast cells, which are present not just in the skin, but in other places in the body, and we know that mast cells are related to histamine and things like hives and itching and redness and swelling, it will cause increased degranulation or breaking open of those mast cells to rupture and spill the histamine, and that is kind of pro-inflammatory. And then in other cells, it can do things like inhibit something called NF-kappa beta, which basically helps limit inflammation. So it's really interesting because it's this bidirectional thing. And why is it? It's because inflammation is an important player in restoring and maintaining the epidermis, the health of your skin. So there's some levels of inflammation that can be beneficial if it's at the right time and the right amount. They can also be damaging if prolonged. And so short-term stress basically triggers wound repair. It can be anti-inflammatory initially. And then if that once the inflammatory cytokines in the skin go down, it gives feedback hey, lower the cortisol production. And that's in the ideal situation. But in people who already have a background tone of upregulated inflammation, or in situations where the stress goes on, and this is, remember, both emotional, mental, or physiological stress goes on and on and on, then what happens is that the prolonged cortisol exposure actually breaks down the barrier function of the skin. So we basically get leaky skin, and it causes it to lose hydration. And it also changes how the distribution of the immune cells, getting from the blood to the skin. So in the short term, you have this enhanced immunity, and in the long term, you have a suppression of the immunity. And so anytime that we have a suppression of immunity and an increase in inflammation and a poor barrier function, that's a bad combo. We see that all the time in the gut, but the same exact thing happens in the skin.
And what's interesting that you're mentioning about the topical steroids, one of my goals this year has been to talk a bit more about topical steroid withdrawal, because there are people that have overdone it with topical steroids, not having known the appropriate way to use them and use them a lot all the time, and then tried to go off of them, and their skin rebelled to a point that your heart breaks. Understanding and listening to the stories that these folks have to tell and have the journey they're walking on. And so one interesting thing is that, and I think a lot of people don't know this, is when you apply topical steroids, they're absorbed through the skin. And those steroids impact your system. Do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, because I see this all the time. I do a lot of work with people with skin like you do, but I also really get a lot of those real critical gut cases, and so, like, for example, I'll often get people who come to me on, prednisone or different kinds of steroid treatment as suppression for the inflammation, let's say for things like inflammatory bowel disease, like a colitis or Crohn's. And it's really, really, really hard to taper them off of those drugs without a flare, right? So the same exact thing is in the skin. And I think part of the reason for this is that when we're using those drugs, because we just have to turn off the fire, they do what they're supposed to do, and they do it really, really well. But they do it because we're basically using these super physiologic dosages of something that we would produce in our own body, meaning we're using more than we could possibly ever create on our own. And those hormones are all subject to feedback loops. Meaning when we see high levels, it tells the, Grand Central Station or wherever that hormone is manufactured, or the signaling centers in the brain, hey, turn down the volume. We don't need to produce them. And I think there's this lag time when it's been suppressed for so long, and then we take away that supplemental source of the hormone. What happens is that all of a sudden we're left in this state where our body is a little bit confused and just goes, oh, wait, now you want me? Yeah.
And the consequences can be pretty, physically painful. And for some people, I've read that topical steroid withdrawal, for example, can last for up to 5 years in some individuals. And you can have long lasting impacts with this. So that said, I wanted to highlight something here, as you were saying, like stressors, because what if you're not sleeping well, right? So every night you're waking up itching. So you're not sleeping well through the night. You get up, you're exhausted. You're super stressed out. Every time you start to itch or whatever, you're like, oh my gosh, is it another flare? So now we're experiencing this trauma of like, what could possibly happening? And then let's just say you do get a flare and you get this itch and you're itching like crazy and this horrible rash and you're dealing with it. You don't feel well. You have to go to work. People look at you funny. And it's just this awful cycle that you get in.
No, it's heartbreaking because, the skin is like, I don't want to, they say the eyes are the window to our soul. Well, like the skin's like the window or like the skylight or something to like our wellness, like how resourced we are and how a lot of times like how it reflects our health. And it's just so upfront, it's like, you can't hide that, right? Like if your digestion's upset or something, you might not be having a great day, but it's not like everyone just walks up to you and sees it unless you tell them. And so like, with your skin, it's just so challenging because, it can be right there, like, even on your face. And so of course that's so vulnerable. And so, yeah, like you said, there's this vicious cycle with sleep and cortisol and the itching. And so we know that there's an association, like, for example, as you're well aware of people with eczema and other kinds of dermatitis, it's almost always worse at night. It's almost always worse at night or before bed. And we know that also people with those conditions tend to see, like if we run HPA axis or adrenal testing, we see that the stress hormones bounce higher at night. And it's a little bit chicken and the egg because both the high cortisol worsens the itching and having the inflammation and the itching, causes the cortisol to bounce high in a response to trying to, help you, to try and address it. And so actually both that situation and the insomnia and stress that it induces, and also what we were just talking about a minute ago with the withdrawal from some of the steroid treatments, both internal and topical, I've actually seen that those are very well facilitated. You can help with that withdrawal and help reprogram some of those hormones when you do testing and work directly with those hormones. And we have some little kind of like, it's almost one of our secret sauces in my clinic is like, yeah, that's one of the things we do when we see someone in a big flare. We'll almost always just like jump right to that to kind of help them, especially if they're tapering from something like prednisone use or topical steroids.
And so do you have any thoughts, like for somebody who's listening to this going, oh my gosh, I can't sleep at night. Is there anything that they could try or do tonight to just see if maybe there's something that they could start to get some relief on that you found helpful for your clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I've had some good results with things like ashwagandha in people who don't have like a specific reaction to that's negative, which is rare. It's not common. But ashwagandha is one of those things that can safely help lower cortisol in people where it's elevated, and it's a safer, less pushy thing where you don't really have to use testing because it is a smart plant. It's an adaptogen. And so I love ashwagandha for that. I really love magnesium because most people are deficient, and it has such an, I mean, I could talk for an hour. We could talk about all the roles magnesium plays, so we won't do that. But I will just say that energetically, it's a very like take the edge off the nerves kind of thing. I particularly like the glycinate form or the chelates because they tend not to have bowel activity for people. So we're not looking for a laxative effect. But those two things I think are super safe and can help kind of, you know, just in this kind of very general fits the public kind of way, help with the itching.
Yeah. And any thoughts on melatonin? Like sometimes I feel like you have to be careful because, right, you were saying there's a feedback loop and you hand your body hormone, and melatonin's a hormone. So you hand your body melatonin and you tell your body, hey, I don't necessarily need you to produce as much. So is there any concern if someone is considered taking this or testing it out? Any thoughts on whether it was a good idea to try or maybe they should talk to their practitioner about it?
You know, I'm a big fan of testing prior to melatonin, but that said, I think it's very safe. Like some of the liposomal forms that are like 1/3 or 1 milligram, you know, like they're very, very low. I think those are pretty safe, especially when we're talking short-term use. And why we would say that is that melatonin and cortisol are like a seesaw. They are, you know, inversely proportionate to each other. So if you have someone with really high cortisol at night, and in particular, if they're not sleeping, melatonin could be a useful tool and may actually be low on testing. So I would say that if you know, decide to try out something like that and you notice, hey, that actually felt like kind of beneficial, and you want to play with, is that the right dose or would I maybe need more? Then that's where I would definitely say testing is probably of service.
Okay. And with melatonin supplementation, do you feel like people notice a difference right away? Like, are they going to take it once and all of a sudden have an amazing night's sleep? Or is it going to be over maybe the course of a few weeks where they need to test this out and see if like that 1 milligram or so would be appropriate for them?
I've seen it go both ways. I'd say, you know, more often we see the latter, right? Like, because sleep is a pattern. It's about patterns and habits, and our body responds the same way. So there's very few things that you take that are natural that all of a sudden, bam, you're sleeping like a baby, you know? So yeah, usually it's going to take, you know, a minimum of 10 days, usually about 3 weeks is the time I would give that. But, you know, that said, melatonin is pretty strong. It's kind of on the druggy, hormone-y end of natural agents that we can use. And so some people will take melatonin, and let's say they took, maybe I've seen this even in people taking 3 milligrams, and they wake up super groggy the next day. And so that was too much for that person's body to tolerate. And that's where you can really, they might have said, hey, I actually slept better, but I just, you know, felt really horrible the next morning. So, okay, that's the kind of thing where you can see that immediate response, and you want to taper that back.
Yeah. And do you have any suggestions or tips for anybody who is in this really bad cycle of stress? And so we know that there's probably some level of cortisol dysregulation. Yeah. Any lifestyle tips that you could share that they might not have thought of? I mean, everyone's like, calm down, do breathing, take a deep breath. But those are the obvious things. Maybe there's some other tips that you might have that people can test out.
Yeah. I mean, the ones that I like are go for a walk in nature. Like there's actually shown to be a balancing effect on cortisol just by like basically what we would call earthing, or I forget what the Japanese name for it, but it translates to forest bathing. And it's essentially like go be in nature away from the sound of like, if possible, cars and planes and whatnot. But literally at the bare minimum, just like go for a walk, get out of your house, breathe some fresh air, get some sunshine on your face. So that's another one. Is I'm a big fan of early morning sunshine exposure, which means like ideally in the first 15 minutes of being awake, that you get the full rays of the sun's light in your eyes without, sunglasses. So that's one that I like. Another one that I like, although this may not always work out for someone who's got an acute skin flare, is a warm evening bath. Now, it doesn't have to be super hot. So like if the hot water flares the, redness of your skin, maybe just a warm bath moderately could work. But that actually has been shown to help modify high evening cortisol and improve quality of sleep tremendously. So I love a bath. Who doesn't love a bath?
Well, it's funny because every time people think of like a solution, they think it has to cost a lot of money, and it doesn't necessarily have to. You just have to create the time and do it. And so there are plenty of free tools that we can access that can make a big impact. And it doesn't mean you have to take a bath every single day. It could be a few times a week. I know for sure that when I need to slow down, especially in the winter months and the cooler months, it's nice to just carve out 15, 20 minutes and just sit still. Yeah. It really does help. This has been so helpful. I think people don't realize, again and again, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many connections between the skin and other parts of the body that we don't often hear about. So this is great. This is the first time we're ever really talking about cortisol impacting the skin on the Healthy Skin Show. So you've got a great gift for everybody. What is that called?
So it is called, I'm going to call it my hormone guide. It has some big, long, fancy name, like something kind of sassy. And I apologize. I should know it's on my website, but it's on the homepage of my website. If you scroll down about halfway, and we can put the link in the show notes. And it's kind of like a hormone guide, so to speak.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's really perfect. And for everybody who's looking to find you, they can find you over at your website, briewieselman.com. You're also on Instagram. You have a great Instagram account with lots of good information. Thank you so much for coming back. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Always so much fun to come be with you.
I'm so appreciative to have Brie come back and share this information with you guys, because the conversation that I've been wanting to have with you over the course of this year is helping you to understand this very intricate relationship between the hormonal balance of cortisol and your adrenals with your skin in connection to topical steroids. So while this conversation wasn't directly about topical steroid withdrawal, I want to help you really understand, no matter what type of skin condition you have, that when topical steroids are used, especially in a chronic state, it can cause problems. And so that's why conversations like this are so important. All of the resources that Brie and I discussed can be found over in the show notes at skinterrupt.com/130. And there you can leave any questions, comments, or thoughts. That way we can keep the conversation going. And if you've suspected that topical steroids might not be the best thing for your skin, and you know other people who probably don't know this, and guess what, guys? Most people do not know this. So it is imperative that you share this with whatever type of community that you are in for your particular skin issue, whether it's psoriasis, eczema, rosacea, perioral dermatitis. Topical steroids tend to be used for a lot of different things. And people oftentimes confuse them as being entirely safe because of the way that they are prescribed and how easy it is to buy them over the counter. Nonetheless, they are a medication, and they do have risks and side effects that people in our community in general, our fellow skin rash warriors, need to know about. So share this episode with them. And before you head out for your day, make sure to head on over to your podcast platform of choice, rate and review the show, and then make sure to hit the subscribe button. That way, the next episode lands on your mobile device of choice. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you are doing well, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.